never publish them. She reportedly told her children that, over and over, for the rest of her life. 8 hours of Jacqueline Kennedy talking with almost no filter, recorded in the rawest months after Dallas, and the one thing she asked for was that no one would ever hear them. They didn't listen. So the question is simple. What was on those tapes that a woman that careful spent decades trying to keep buried? The answer isn't a scandal. It's a person. The only surviving document of the real Jacqueline Kennedy, the unedited woman beneath the icon the country spent 30 years treating as national property. To understand why she feared those recordings, you have to understand what she had become before they were made, and why becoming it had cost her everything she was trying to protect. November 25, 1963, 3 days after Dallas. 102 heads of state and foreign dignitaries arrived in Washington for the state funeral of President John F. Kennedy. Charles de Gaulle was there, Haile Selassie, Prince Philip. The procession moved from the White House down Pennsylvania Avenue to St. Matthew's Cathedral, 3 blocks, and Jacqueline Kennedy walked every step of it. What people remember isn't the dignitaries. What they remember is the woman in black. She wore a long mourning veil. By 1963, mourning veils had fallen almost entirely out of fashion. The White House Historical Association later noted that her choice was historically unusual for the era, that no one had worn one at a major public occasion in years. She wore it anyway. She walked behind the caisson rather than riding. She had requested the muffled drums, the riderless black horse, the precise ceremonial cadence of a military funeral at a scale Washington had not seen since Lincoln. She walked flanked by foreign statesmen, hand in hand with Caroline, age 6, and John Jr., age 3, in a double-breasted blue coat. When the moment came at the steps of the cathedral, John Jr. raised a small hand and saluted the flag-draped coffin passing before him. The boy was 3 years old and 2 days out from his birthday. His mother had told him to do that. She had reached down at the right moment, caught his eye, and guided his hand upward. She didn't break. In the acute hours after the shooting, while still at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, she had refused to change out of the pink Chanel suit with its dark stains. "Let them see what they've done," she reportedly said. By the time Air Force One landed at Andrews that evening, she had already begun making decisions about the funeral's visual symbolism, the eternal flame at Arlington, the caisson rather than a motorcade, the walk itself. She worked through details while still in the deepest shock of her life. She was 34 years old, and she understood that this moment was being seen by millions simultaneously around the world, and that how it was seen would shape how her husband lived in memory. The imagery that crystallized into national myth was, in large part, her own design. She built the frame that would hold her for decades. She just didn't know yet that the frame would also hold her. In the days immediately after the assassination, she sat with journalist Theodore H. White of Life magazine and introduced the word that would define the Kennedy years in American memory. She told White that she and the president had listened, at the end of long days, to the cast recording of the Lerner and Loewe musical Camelot, that the lyric she loved best was the one about one brief shining moment that was known as Camelot. She handed the administration its legend. White's piece ran on December 6, 1963. The framework she offered him became the dominant account of the Kennedy presidency almost immediately, and it held for the better part of a generation. This requires clear understanding. She didn't merely absorb the mythology that formed around her. She helped build it. The composed widow was, to a significant degree, a conscious construction. And once she had built it, it took on a life of its own that she could no longer fully direct. The public's Jacqueline Kennedy was a specific figure, defined in those early months with a precision that would hold for decades. Newspapers reached for the same vocabulary again and again: composure, dignity, courage, elegance. A peer-reviewed analysis of letters written to her in the weeks following the assassination found that her bearing during the funeral had moved ordinary Americans so deeply that more than one correspondent associated her composure with a national ideal. She had become, in the cultural language of late 1963, more icon than person. A Cambridge University Press analysis of her public afterlife describes celebrity lives as dynamic, volatile, and open-ended. But Jackie's, in the months after Dallas, was deliberately frozen. The composed widow was a portrait fixed at a single moment, held in black and white. She reinforced the silence that surrounded it. She gave no further in-depth public interviews about her White House years after the Camelot piece. In an era when the press wanted everything from her, she offered almost nothing. The silence was interpreted, correctly, as grief. It was also, just as correctly, management. What the country didn't know was that she had spoken, at length, on tape. In January 1964, 8 weeks after Dallas, Jacqueline Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy formally approved an oral history project to capture the recollections of those close to the late president for the future Kennedy Presidential Library. The project was ambitious. It would ultimately produce more than 1,000 interviews about JFK's life and career, with sessions eventually including Robert McNamara, Theodore Sorensen, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, and Lady Bird Johnson. But it was also, from its origins, an act of narrative control as much as historical preservation. The project, as documented in the record of the Johnson White House era, was inspired by Jacqueline Kennedy, who wanted a single authorized history to overshadow competing accounts. The oral history was itself a myth management instrument. She wanted one version of the story out in front of all the others, and she wanted it to be hers. The historian chosen to conduct her personal sessions was Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., Pulitzer Prize-winning author of 1,000 Days, former special assistant to President Kennedy in the White House, and a longtime Kennedy family friend. The JFK Library's own materials describe him as historian and Kennedy family friend. Caroline Kennedy, in her foreword to the eventual publication, called him the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who had served as a special assistant to my father. Schlesinger wasn't a neutral party sitting across from a subject he barely knew. He was a Kennedy loyalist, conducting interviews for a Kennedy institution about a Kennedy president, speaking with a woman he knew personally and whose account of the administration he had a real stake in shaping. His biography of the Kennedy years was already underway. He brought to those sessions a dual role, academic historian and family ally, that runs through everything that was recorded. In early March 1964, approximately 100 days after the assassination, Schlesinger arrived at Jacqueline Kennedy's new home in an upscale Washington, D.C. neighborhood. She had left the White House and established herself there in the weeks after November 22nd, trying to build something resembling a private life in a city that couldn't stop watching her. The sessions took place in that house, over weeks, in a domestic setting rather than any institutional one. Before they began, Schlesinger told her to speak as though she were addressing a historian of the 21st century. He wanted her to understand the sessions were being made for posterity, not for the present. She began to speak, and those who later studied those recordings noted that her voice started with what Schlesinger himself described as a tremble that grew stronger with time. As the weeks went on and the sessions accumulated, the trembling diminished and something harder emerged in its place. What followed was 7 sessions conducted over the spring of 1964, producing approximately 8.5 hours of audio tape. A pattern recurred throughout. From time to time, Jackie would ask Schlesinger to turn off the machine so she could say something privately. Then she would pause, look at him, and ask, "Should I say that on the recorder?" He generally said yes. In his approach to those moments, Schlesinger would tell her, "Why don't you say it? You have control over the transcript." She generally agreed. Those moments of hesitation are, in retrospect, the most revealing detail about the entire enterprise. She was deciding in real time what future historians would and wouldn't receive. The recordings that make her sound unguarded were the product of a series of small, deliberate choices. She wasn't unfiltered. She was just filtered less than in every other recorded context of her public life. She knew the machine was on. She chose what it captured. And she still said things that, 47 years later, would make her daughter's daughters absolutely horrified. The range of subjects across the 7 sessions was sweeping. JFK's early political campaigns, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Charles de Gaulle, Nikita Khrushchev, Indira Gandhi, Lyndon Johnson, Lady Bird Johnson, Martin Luther King Jr., her view of women in politics, her private doubts about herself as First Lady, her husband's emotional life, the things he never said to anyone but her children running through the Oval Office, the terrible, ordinary details of what it was like to live inside an American presidency and then to survive it. She was speaking from 4 months out from the worst day of her life. The wound was still open. The sessions were the most fully documented record of what Jacqueline Kennedy actually thought that has ever been produced. And when they were done, she locked them away. When the 7 sessions were complete, she moved the audio tapes to the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and sealed them. The transcripts went separately into a safe deposit vault in New York City. Both repositories were subject to access conditions she specified. The JFK Library's own newsletter, published in fall 2011, when the recordings were finally unsealed, stated the material had been sealed for 47 years and kept under seal in accordance with Mrs. Kennedy's wishes. Hyperion's press release, when the book was eventually announced, confirmed, "The 7 interviews have remained strictly sealed since then, in accordance with Mrs. Kennedy's wishes." The audio publisher's description said the same. Multiple institutional sources, all agreeing. From the moment the sessions ended in spring 1964 until her death from lymphoma on May 19, 1994, Jacqueline Kennedy never returned to them publicly. She released nothing. She said nothing. The library held the tapes, and the safe deposit vault in New York held the transcripts, and the wall she had built around both held for 30 years after her death. The family knew the material existed. Caroline Kennedy has said her mother spoke of the tapes to her children over the years. They weren't a complete secret within the family. But the precise legal terms of the seal, whether a formal deed of gift specified an exact release date, or whether the restriction flowed from a personal family understanding with the library, aren't fully resolved in any public archival document. What is documented is the outcome: 47 years of silence. To understand what that silence meant as a deliberate act, the Manchester dispute is useful context. When historian William Manchester began writing The Death of a President, his authorized account of the assassination, a project Jackie had agreed to participate in, she spoke to him at length. She cooperated. She opened up. Then, when she saw what he had written with what she had given him, her attorneys sought a show cause order from the New York State Supreme Court, requiring Manchester and his publisher, Harper and Row, to refrain from releasing the book. She had approved it, and then fought it in court when the approved version arrived. The notes from those Manchester sessions were sealed for 100 years, until 2067. The oral history tapes were the same instinct operating at larger scale. She created historical records and then tried, with institutional and legal mechanisms, to determine exactly when and how those records would be read. The tapes were the piece of the project she had decided, definitively, not to deliver on her own watch. Which brings the question back to where it started. NPR, previewing the recordings on September 12, 2011, described them as presenting a very candid Jackie Kennedy, who was speaking honestly and disarmed a short time after the assassination of her husband. The interviews aren't your usual gloss on history. The BBC, on the day of the book's release, described her voice on those tapes as at once sharp, tender, political, sassy, breathless, as was her style, self-deprecating, and deliciously gossipy. The Washington Post called the recordings evidence of a catty, sometimes caustic, politically curious First Lady who had strong views about everyone. Reviewer Amy Davidson articulated the central contrast directly: the gap between the many paper doll versions and fetishized images of Jackie and the forceful, opinionated woman revealed by the tapes. A listener encountering the recordings without prior Kennedy fixation summarized it simply: "I was really surprised how candid Jackie Kennedy was." The woman on those tapes had opinions about nearly everyone she had encountered in 3 years of proximity to political power, and she expressed them without great ceremony. Charles de Gaulle she called simply that egomaniac. This was a head of state she had met in person, spoken with in French, charmed at state dinners. Off the record, the assessment was different. Indira Gandhi, already a prominent figure in Indian political life, a real prune, horrible woman. Laconic, specific, and apparently final. Lady Bird Johnson, whose husband had taken the oath of office on Air Force One on the afternoon of November 22nd, with Jackie's still wearing the pink suit, she said Lady Bird behaved like a trained hunting dog, always positioned, always note-taking the moment Lyndon Johnson spoke. On Johnson himself as vice president, she was brief and unflattering, a man of enormous ego who, in her telling, simply hadn't delivered. These aren't the muted assessments of a woman performing grief. These are the private verdicts of someone who had spent 3 years watching political power operate from the closest possible range and had formed hard views about what she saw. The political dimension of the recordings reached further than personal characterizations. She recounted conversations in which JFK and Robert Kennedy had privately discussed how to prevent Lyndon Johnson from leading the Democratic ticket in 1968, putting words around a long-circulated suspicion about the Kennedy brothers' relationship with their vice president. The suggestion that she was offering this story to Schlesinger, a Kennedy ally, for a Kennedy archive, is impossible to separate from the content itself. She was making sure a particular version of that story existed in the record. She was telling future historians where she stood. On the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, she told Schlesinger what she had said to her husband at the height of the standoff, when nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union seemed genuinely possible. "I just want to be with you, and I want to die with you, and the children do too, then live without you." That conversation had been private. Nobody else heard it. She had held it for 47 years. Now she set it into a machine, to a historian she trusted, in a Washington living room, 4 months after her husband was shot dead in a Dallas motorcade. She described the days of the crisis as the period when she was closest to JFK, staying by his side, barely leaving the residence. The intimacy of it, the plainness of a woman who wouldn't leave her husband's side even for her children, is the kind of thing that doesn't survive the passage to a formal public statement. On the Bay of Pigs, the failed CIA-sponsored invasion of Cuba in April 1961, the first great humiliation of the Kennedy presidency, she recalled him weeping privately with her, his head in his hands, heartbroken for the men lost. John Kennedy alone with his wife after the worst day of his early presidency. She had been carrying that image for over 4 decades. It reached the public record through those reels. Somewhere in the background of one session, barely audible on the tape, young John Kennedy Jr. was asked where his father was. He was 3 years old. He said, "He's gone to heaven." She kept talking. Then there were the lines that cut against every idealized portrait of her. She told Schlesinger that women should never be in politics because they weren't suited to it. Too emotional, unable to separate feeling from function. The politically engaged women who had preferred Adlai Stevenson to JFK, she dismissed in pointed terms. Women, she implied, whose personal lives had driven them toward politics for the wrong reasons. When Schlesinger asked where she got her own political opinions, she said she deferred entirely to her husband's. His views, she said, were going to be the best. She was direct about the broader category. Women should never be in politics. They weren't suited to it. Caroline Kennedy, when asked about those lines in 2011, offered 2 responses almost simultaneously. Her daughters were absolutely horrified at some opinions, and she chose not to edit any of it. At George Washington University on September 28, 2011, she explained, "I decided I really didn't have the right to alter the historical record, and I had confidence that people who listened and read the book would come to the same conclusion." She acknowledged her mother sounded, in some passages, like a 1950s housewife, then asked people to remember that her mother had arrived at the White House at 31 with a newborn, totally overwhelmed by the prospect of being a public figure in a political world that had not yet found a language for what a First Lady's intellectual engagement was supposed to look like. "That's obviously not the mother I remember later on," Caroline said. On Martin Luther King Jr., the recordings caught a moment that required additional context to understand. J. Edgar Hoover, who had made a sustained institutional effort to discredit King, had passed information to JFK about King's personal conduct, some of it sexually explicit, sourced from FBI surveillance. Jackie was relaying back what had been brought to her and her husband. I said, "Oh, but Jack, that's so terrible. I mean, that man is, such a phony." Caroline Kennedy told Diane Sawyer that her mother had actually been fond of King. The statement on the tape was a relaying of FBI-sourced gossip about a man Hoover despised, not an independent assessment, but a transmission of what the surveillance state had fed into the room. That context matters. It's also, like much of what is on those tapes, irreducibly complicated. The EW coverage of the ABC special captured another passing moment that landed quietly in the middle of everything. On the recording, a sound in the background. The joyous rustling of a young John F. Kennedy Jr. The audio itself had an ambient dimension, ice hitting glasses, a cigarette being lit, a plane going over. The domestic noise of a Washington home, under the weight of all that was being said in it. The scholars who analyzed the recordings for peer-reviewed publication reached a layered verdict that complicates the unfiltered frame. A 2015 article in Studia Anglica Poznaniensia concluded that Jackie's oral history isn't a neutral recollection. It carefully focuses on the president's best moments and functions partly as an act of commemorative advocacy. The same analysis found that Jackie assures her interviewer that she shared her husband's political opinions, while simultaneously demonstrating across 7 sessions detailed knowledge of foreign policy and domestic politics that explicitly contradicts that disclaimer. The disavowal and the evidence contradicted each other in the same sessions. She was saying she was politically passive, while proving in the same breath that she wasn't. The article's most precise observation: much is revealed in her statements, but even more through her tone of voice, and perhaps most through things she chooses to omit. The omissions are visible even in what did make it onto tape. When the conversation reached the subject of JFK's personal conduct, his faithfulness as a husband, she chose 8 words. Renewals of love after brief separations. No elaboration, no names. A formulation that was true, technically accurate, and completely opaque to anyone who didn't already know what it meant. In 1964, the press corps understood exactly what it meant and had chosen not to print it. The general public wouldn't have mainstream confirmation of JFK's extramarital life until the Church Committee hearings in 1975 and the Judith Exner memoir in 1977. Renewals of love after brief separations was, in 1964, navigating a silence that the press had agreed to maintain. She wasn't breaking it. She was recording around it, with precision. Schlesinger had written, in work completed before the oral history sessions, that underneath what he called Jackie's veil of lovely inconsequence, there was a tremendous awareness, an all-seeing eye, and a ruthless judgment. The tapes confirmed it completely. Candid enough to call de Gaulle an egomaniac, controlled enough to reduce her husband's infidelities to a euphemism, both in the same sessions, to the same machine, in the same spring. Arthur Schlesinger later described the earlier period of Jackie's public presentation, that she had underneath a veil of lovely inconsequence, precisely the quality that the oral history recorded most clearly. The woman he had known before Dallas was already the woman on those tapes. The tapes just got her to say it out loud. She described the White House years as the greatest privilege and their happiest years. She worried, arriving there at 31, that she was just such a dud. She called it a fishbowl. She had told her children while they were running through the corridors and hiding under the president's desk that their time in the White House was temporary, and then said to Schlesinger with a quiet weight that reads across 6 decades of distance, "I'm glad I did, because of the way it ended." The private voice on those tapes wasn't the opposite of her public image. It was its interior. The woman who had designed the funeral and invented Camelot was here in a Washington living room, working through grief and anger and private conviction, aware of the machine, occasionally asking for it to be turned off, but talking, really talking, in a way she never had before and never would again. She went back to silence after the sessions for 3 more decades. The country's sense of ownership over Jacqueline Kennedy reached its most explicit expression in the autumn of 1968. She had been a widow for nearly 5 years. She had held to the public role assigned to her, kept quiet, stayed out of politics, focused on her children. Robert Kennedy, who had stood beside her at Dallas and co-approved the oral history project with her in January 1964, was shot dead at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles on June 5, 1968. She watched the country she lived in kill 2 of the men closest to her inside 5 years. On October 20, 1968, she married Aristotle Onassis on his private Greek island, Skorpios. The response in America was immediate and, in large part, ferocious. Biographers who tracked the press coverage of that week documented headlines whose emotional register has rarely been replicated in coverage of a private marriage. America has lost a saint. Jack Kennedy dies today a 2nd time. A scholarly paper analyzing the Onassis marriage and its cultural reception identified the phrase, "Jackie, how could you?" as part of the media vocabulary of that moment. The Vatican publicly disapproved of the union. She was a Catholic marrying a divorced Greek Orthodox man in a Greek Orthodox ceremony on a private island. The nickname Jackie O entered the language as shorthand for a transformation nobody had wanted. Her biographer summarized the American press's view of her new husband in 5 adjectives: too old, too foreign, too small, too dark, and too rich. One biographer at the time portrayed Onassis as the indulgent squire of a gold-digging hedonist. The press framing was uncomplicated. She had possessed something sacred on behalf of a nation, and she had traded it for money and a private island. She had defected from the myth. What almost nobody was saying loudly in October 1968 was the fact that sat beneath that reaction. The marriage being treated as sacred, the one she was accused of betraying, had not been faithful. JFK's serial affairs were known to the Washington press corps well before 1963. Reporters knew, editors knew. The arrangement that held the information out of print while Kennedy was alive had held after his death through the same convention, through the same unspoken agreement between powerful men that a politician's private indiscretions weren't newsworthy. The Church Committee began pulling threads in 1975. Judith Exner published her memoir in 1977. The fully documented picture took another decade beyond that to enter the mainstream historical record. In October 1968, the public was condemning a widow for moving on from a marriage that had required considerable personal resilience to survive, and they were doing it in defense of a myth that the press already understood wasn't the whole truth. The hypocrisy didn't live entirely in the public reaction. It lived in what journalism had chosen, for years, not to print, and in the gap between what the press corps knew and what the reading public had been given. The people who wept over Jackie's betrayal had been operating with an incomplete account of the thing they were defending. There was a quieter strand of American opinion that watched the Onassis marriage from a different angle. People who had followed those years from their own kitchens and living rooms, who had watched a young woman hold a country together after the worst televised event of the century. Some of them understood that whatever she chose to do with her own private life was hers to choose. After June 1968, when Robert Kennedy was killed, she had documented reason to fear for herself and her children that went beyond reasonable caution. 2 Kennedys murdered by political violence in an era of political violence. The security Onassis could provide, a private island accessible only by his resources, the name recognition to buffer the press, the money to remove her children from the sightlines that had defined their entire lives, wasn't what the front pages called it. One biographer, writing with later perspective, described what the Onassis marriage gave her as simply the kind of sanctuary Jackie needed. That reading never dominated the coverage in 1968, but it wasn't an unreasonable one, and many people who had watched her closely arrived at it on their own. The tapes, locked in the library through all of this, through the Onassis marriage and the press coverage and the decades that followed, had nothing to say about any of it. They had been made in 1964, in a different season of her life, but they held the proof, unavailable to everyone, that the woman the press was denouncing for an autonomous private decision had been, 4 years earlier, privately rendering judgments about international leaders and vice presidents that would have been front-page news on their own. The vault and the silence and the sealed reels were all the same instinct, exercised across 15 years and multiple different contexts. She decided what you knew about her. She had always decided. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died on May 19, 1994, of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, at her apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York. She was 64. She had given no in-depth public interview about her White House years since Theodore White's Camelot piece in December 1963. The tapes were still sealed. Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., who had sat across from her in that Washington living room in the spring of 1964 and asked her to speak to historians of the future, died in February 2007. He had lived long enough to know the recordings existed and that he couldn't speak about them publicly. He never wrote specifically about what she had said in those sessions, beyond brief references in his own journals and memoirs. In April 2010, the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and the publisher Hyperion jointly announced that the recordings and transcripts would be released. The stated occasion was the 50th anniversary of JFK's inauguration, which had occurred in January 1961. Caroline Kennedy, the sole surviving child of the President and First Lady, would serve as editor of the resulting volume and write its foreword. She was working with her longtime editor and attorney. The announcement specified that the family planned to make available both the interview transcripts and the audio recordings of the sessions. The word used in the 2010 announcement was 6.5 hours, though later release materials settled on approximately 8.5 hours. The difference between those figures was never fully explained. On September 13, 2011, ABC News aired a 2-hour primetime special. Diane Sawyer sat with Caroline Kennedy in a formal on-camera interview. For the first time in a public setting, Jacqueline Kennedy's voice came out of the sealed vault and into living rooms, her actual voice, in the actual sessions, speaking in the breathy register that researchers have acoustically described as distinctive, and that journalists variously characterized as sassy, sharp, tender, and deliciously gossipy. The crystal clarity of the audio surprised people. Somewhere in the background, through the remastering, you could hear ice hitting a glass. On September 14, 2011, 47 years after the sessions were recorded, 17 years after Jacqueline Kennedy's death, Jacqueline Kennedy, Historic Conversations on Life with John F. Kennedy, was published by Hyperion, packaged with 8 CDs of digitally remastered audio. Historian Michael Beschloss provided the annotations and historical context. The JFK Library described it as the day the recordings were made available to the public and historians for the first time ever. Caroline's public explanation of the decision was deliberate and, in the texture of the evidence, genuine. At the book's events and in press appearances, she said repeatedly that her mother's underlying goal had been to capture her memories of her husband and his administration while they were still fresh. She said the sessions had been formal interviews, not accidentally recorded conversations, that both participants understood they were creating a primary source document for future historians. She described her mother as having believed that future generations would benefit from her commitment to tell the truth. Speaking at George Washington University on September 28, 2011, she articulated the central case for release with precision. There was one voice that was lacking, and that was Jacqueline Kennedy's. As a result of this oral history, we're able to restore that voice to the mix. Then she named her reasoning for releasing it now rather than later. The moment seems right. Enough time has passed so that they can be appreciated for their unique insight. She acknowledged the difficulty. In today's world of cautious political memoirs, she said, some of what her mother had recorded would be surprising. Her daughters were absolutely horrified at some opinions. She had struggled, she said, with the question of whether to edit at all, whether to trim the repetitions, remove the comments that might seem embarrassing, smooth the views her mother clearly no longer held by the time of her death. She chose against it. I decided I really didn't have the right to alter the historical record, she told the audience. She released everything. The tabloid version of this, a 2013 New York Post piece headlined, "Caroline Kennedy Sells Out Camelot," claiming Jackie had ordered the tapes kept secret until 50 years after her death, isn't what the institutional record supports. The JFK Library's own materials describe the tapes as sealed for 47 years, and tied the release to the 50th anniversary of the inauguration, not to any specific condition measured from the date of Jackie's death. The BBC and at least one documentary claimed a 50 years after death condition as a binding legal decree, which would have placed the legal release date in May 2044. The actual 2011 release, 17 years after her death, would have violated that condition if it were real. The available evidence suggests Jackie wanted a long embargo, measured in decades rather than years, and that her family judged the time had come. Whether that judgment honored or overrode her precise wishes depends on whether those wishes were more specific than the record shows. The record doesn't show they were. What's certain is this: Caroline Kennedy opened a record her mother created, at a time she concluded was historically appropriate, and chose to present it without editing. She decided the real Jacqueline Kennedy was more valuable to history than the protected version that had stood in her place for 47 years. On this point, the recordings themselves make the case. The woman who comes through approximately 8.5 hours of audio isn't the figure of the funeral photographs. She is sharp-tongued and funny and sometimes unfair, deeply informed and privately merciless, capable of enormous tenderness about her husband and children in the same sessions where she dismisses a head of state as an egomaniac and a sitting vice president as a man of enormous ego who simply hadn't delivered. The voice on those tapes is the voice Schlesinger had predicted when he wrote, years before Dallas, that beneath Jackie's public surface lay a tremendous awareness, an all-seeing eye, and a ruthless judgment. He was right. She had just never said it where anyone could record it. She had compared the White House to a fishbowl. She had said she worried, arriving there at 31, that she was just such a dud. She had said it was the greatest privilege and their happiest years. Both things were true. Both things are on the tape. One of the strangest moments in the EW coverage of the ABC special captures something about the texture of those recordings that no review quite prepared people for. She said she had told Caroline and John Jr., while they were running through the Oval Office and playing under the president's desk, that their time in the White House was temporary. Then she paused and added, in the breathy voice that had been locked in a safe deposit vault in New York for 4 decades, "I'm glad I did, because of the way it ended." That sentence contains everything the marble widow image could never hold: the foresight, the grief, the restraint, the bleak humor underneath the restraint. She had known, even before she needed to know, that it would end. She had prepared her children for it, and she was glad she had, because of the way it ended. The recordings Jacqueline Kennedy wanted sealed for the better part of half a century aren't the opposite of her public self. They are its source material. The same mind that designed the funeral down to the black veil and the eternal flame, that handed Theodore White the Camelot framework in a grieving conversation in Hyannisport, that went to the New York State Supreme Court to suppress the Manchester book. That same mind sat across from Arthur Schlesinger in a Washington living room in the spring of 1964, 4 months out from the worst thing that had ever happened to her, and talked for 8.5 hours about power and grief and the cost of being who she was. She asked for the machine to be turned off sometimes. She looked at it and decided to speak anyway. She wasn't hiding a scandal. She was hiding a person. The real, unedited woman underneath the icon the country insisted on owning. Candid about the powerful, fierce in her private judgments, tender about the people she loved, funny in moments nobody was supposed to see, and fully aware of all of it, is the one on those tapes. The sealed recordings she wanted the world never to hear are the only place she ever fully spoke, and hearing them is how you finally meet the Jackie the fairy tale was built to cover. Subscribe for more stories like this.